is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In Montgomery, Alabama, an epidemic of violence has shadowed the class of 2020 throughout their high school careers. Some of their classmates were killed before making it to graduation day. Reporter Krista Johnson of the Montgomery Advertiser set out to learn more about them and to understand how trauma is shaping a generation of young people, their schools, and their communities. Krista, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much.
Let's start at the beginning. How did this project get on your radar?
Sure. So I would actually say I started thinking about it after attending the EWA seminar last year. Sonali with the LA Times had discussed her story about the proximity of violence in her schools. And then I started thinking about our students. In the short time I'd been at the Advertiser, there had already been a few students who were shot and killed. And so I just wanted to think a little more critically about how that might be impacting our school district as a whole. We are currently under state intervention. A lot of our schools are labeled as failing. And so I just wanted to have a deeper conversation about what our students are struggling with outside the school day that could be impacting what happens inside.
So you really see this as community violence as an education story?
Most definitely. You can't expect children who stay up all night listening to gunshots, who have lost their friends unexpectedly in violent ways, to go into a classroom and be productive all day. It's impossible. Adults can't do that. Why would we expect children to?
You identify 19 individuals who were killed during those high school years. And we should mention they're not all high school students. They range in age from a young baby right up into the late teens. What was the parameters you set for this? Because I know there were also some tragic deaths during those years that were not included in this 19.
Initially, I started with only gun violence victims. And then I thought a little more critically about it. You know, there was the baby who was beaten, and there was a stabbing, and there was one girl who was fleeing gunfire when she was struck by a car. So I thought about it, and their friends and families were suffering the same ways, whether it was, you know, at the hands of a gun or not. And the story wasn't necessarily about gun violence. It was just about violence and how it impacts children. I included some students who had dropped out of school but were 18 because they felt whether or not they were in the building at that time, they still had friends who were sitting in classrooms struggling with that loss. And I started when the class of 2020 would have started high school. So those 4 years. And then I cut it off right when they graduated, because there was actually a student a couple days after who was murdered, and I struggled whether or not to include him. And it came down to the frank reality that there was always going to be children added to this list. So I had to be strict on that cutoff date.
What did you find in terms of some of the common factors for these young people, particularly in terms of their relationship with schools?
All of these children came from very different backgrounds, lived wildly different lives, and they still met the same fate. So that was the point I was trying to give to people, because there's some portions of our community that might live in a different side of town and think, well, these kids put themselves in harm's way. And that's not the case. You know, some were thriving students, some had dropped out, some hadn't even made it to school yet.
What did you learn, though, about the role the school was playing in terms of identifying some of these students who need emotional support and then providing it? I'm thinking about their friends and survivors. Whether or not they witnessed directly someone being killed, they're still impacted by this violence and this loss.
So our district paired up with the Family Sunshine Center several years ago to provide counseling for students who were suffering after witnessing domestic violence or had been abused themselves. And what they found is that the parameters they had set were too strict, and that a lot of kids were dealing with this trauma of witnessing violence or being exposed to violence. When a student dies, the district identifies their close group of friends, and they bring in counselors, and they basically set up a case file on these best friends and look for red flags that they're not grieving in a healthy way for so many days. I think it's like a 90-day thing, but frankly, it's just there's so much that the district isn't able to identify and help each of these students. And then even if they are able to provide the services, offer them, there's overcoming the barriers of mental health stigma or transportation to and from the psychologist, a lot of things. and our district is not funded very well. And so there's a lot more that's needed that I believe they would like to provide, but just can't.
You profiled one young woman who lost her boyfriend to violence. Tell us a little bit about how you built that relationship.
So I met Helen her first week of high school, and I had reached out to the district with this story idea of following a first generation student, first person to graduate high school through their senior year, being there when they get their ACT score back and when they're applying for schools and trying to go through that FAFSA process essentially on their own. I'm a first generation student, so I knew navigating all that was just crazy. And for a student like that, they identified Helen, and her story prior to losing her boyfriend was already remarkable. And she'd already lost someone very close to her to violence, and was just continuing every day to show up. And then a month later, her boyfriend died. And so the story shifted to, focusing on how she processed that and whether or not she was going to make it to graduation day.
Was it difficult to convince her to participate in this story? And I'm wondering, how you built that trust and what also you shared with her in the idea of, things on the internet live forever.
So the first time I met Helen, her mom was there, and that was important to me to make sure that her mom was aware of what I wanted to talk about. And they were both very on board. Helen's extremely mature for her age and was very open about her feelings and what she had experienced after losing her boyfriend. It did become very difficult as far as catching her when she was able to talk about it, or when, there were times I'd showed up to talk and she just wasn't able to at that point. But I just was consistent. I reached out. We had a lot of conversations via text message. I kept up with her social media so I could somewhat know what was going on when we weren't talking. And, it's just spent the year building that relationship. I also know a lot of people in her life, community leaders that are very close to her family. I think that helped build trust as well. I'd already established those relationships, and therefore she wasn't as reluctant to open up to me.
That's something I've been hearing a lot, particularly for this age group, for these high schoolers, is a lot of them prefer to communicate by text, if not exclusively, at least at first, and reporters really need to be flexible about that.
Yeah, I'm not that far removed from high school myself, so that wasn't a hard transition for me. And a lot of students these days, at least in Montgomery, are super active on social media, and they don't put I don't know why, but none of their profiles are private. So that's become a pretty big part of my reporting when I'm profiling a student. There's some things Helen didn't say to me, but she posted on Facebook. And I was able to kind of say, hey, I saw your post. What was that about? And then that kind of opened up dialogue, different conversations for questions I wouldn't have thought of on my own.
We're talking with reporter Krista Johnson of the Montgomery Advertiser about her reporting on the impact of violence on the city's youth. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. Krista, we talked a little bit about some of what you found in your reporting. I'd like to shift gears and hear a little bit more about how you did this. Was this a tough sell to your editor?
Not at all, honestly. The Montgomery Advertiser has a history of ignoring certain communities, and my editor, Brocraft, has been here a little over 4 years, and he's been very intentional about changing that and trying to make sure we are representative of everyone in Montgomery. So when I came to him about this, he knew how important it'd be to the community, and he was very supportive.
Well, that's great to hear. I want to talk about that, about reporting on communities that have been overlooked, but also that are very different from our own. You've been in Montgomery for about 2 years. You were previously reporting in Iowa. What is it like to try to build trust there with sources whose backgrounds are very different from your own?
Obviously, Iowa is a very different place than Montgomery, Alabama. And that was a shock and a shift I had to get used to, but I think I'm always open and honest about that when I sit down to interview people. I also come from an impoverished background. I'm familiar with the prison system and drug addiction and all these things. That doesn't mean I understand what other people are going through, but it does mean I understand pain. And so I will say that to people at some point, like, look, I know I don't know this specific thing you're going through, but I can imagine what it might make you feel like. I don't try to pretend that I know all the answers, and I tell them that, and that usually eases some of the discomfort, I think.
What you're describing, I mean, sort of elevates the argument to be made for diversity in newsrooms, racial diversity, obviously, but also socioeconomic.
Yes, definitely. I just had that conversation with someone. I think our newsroom has been very intentional about diversifying as far as race. But yeah, I don't know a lot of reporters who come from the socioeconomic background that I do. And I didn't notice that at the beginning of my career or understand the value in that. But now as I grow, I realize like there's just things I have been through and that I know about that other people don't. And that is a gift rather than a barrier.
What did you learn from this project about how to cover the topic of trauma and its impact, particularly on young people?
I learned that I was completely wrong about what I assumed this grief would look like. I'd pictured going into classrooms and seeing kids throw temper tantrums and fights and lashing out because they couldn't process this grief. And what I learned is that's not at all the case. Most of these kids go through the day and smile and act like nothing's going on. And that is worse in a way. They're silently grieving without anyone knowing. And not just them, but there's generations of people here that have endured violence in their neighborhoods and communities.
You also have written a very moving, I'll say it, very moving first person piece about the impact of covering this story on your own mental well being and processing this grief and processing this information. Can you share a little bit about why you wanted to write that piece?
It was extremely difficult sitting with these families, listening to what they've been through, attending a funeral, going to the vigils. I didn't lose anyone personally. It wasn't ever my loved one, or I've never met any of these students. And I walked away just lost about how to process what I was feeling. And, I'm crying over not meeting this kid because he sounded so cool. And I just wanted to point out to readers that here I am, privileged in many different aspects. I have a great support system. I have access to mental health. I have a career and I have money, and I still am struggling with this. So here is a set of children. Some of them have all of that, but others don't. And we're still expecting them to figure it out and kind of pull themselves up by the bootstraps.
So you mentioned high up that Sonali Kohli's project for the LA Times was part of your inspiration here. And, certainly one of the things we hear from reporters often is they want to try something like this, but there's an issue of the logistics and the time management. How do you recommend they sort of approach this or structure this? How did you manage to do this project and still cover your beat?
So I started this back in October, and at that time we had 13 students on the list that I wanted to profile, and that grew to 19 by the end. A lot of this reporting was done outside the regular work days for families. Meeting on the weekends worked better for them. And then that allowed me to still focus on my daily beat coverage. I kept myself very organized as far as lists of each student and which students I had gotten their pictures and who I wanted to cut or interview and who I hadn't, and then labeled each of my Word documents with PTSD hyphen the name of whoever I interviewed. And so at the end of interviewing, I copied it all in a Word document. It was like hundreds of pages. And I deleted the stuff I knew I wouldn't use and then printed it and highlighted. But also another part of it was I wrote about some of these students through this, like outside the project. The 1-year anniversary for Jalen Saunders, that allowed me to profile who he was as a student and what his loss meant to his family. And then there was the 2-year anniversary of Chauncey. And then there were the students who died during this reporting process. And so that allowed me to kind of build paragraphs that made it into the larger story.
What were some of the roadblocks that you encountered on this project?
Finding all of the kids' families was extremely hard. A lot of this was done through social media. So I'd find the students' Facebook and then figure out who their friends and moms were and then message them and then look at my mutual friends with the mom because I knew she wouldn't see my message because we weren't friends. And we'd go to our other file. So then I'd reach out to our mutual friend and say, hey, can you tell this mom that I'm trying to contact her? I'd send her a message. And it was a lot of going back and forth. But at bare minimum, I wanted each child's photo. Some moms weren't ready to talk, but they said, yes, you can use this photo from Facebook. So the other thing, like I had said, I had to overcome my own assumptions about what this would look like. And once I did that, I was able to ask better questions from the students. But a lot of times they would say they were fine, and then they would say something that I knew I'd never thought. Like one student telling me, I pray for my friends every day that this doesn't happen to them like it did Jalen. And I thought, I've never prayed that one of my friends won't get killed. So it was kind of like reading what they were saying and what that meant outside of those few words.
And what's been the community reaction to the project?
It's been very good. I've had a lot of people reach out and thank me and say, this is what we've been talking about for years. And it just felt like no one was acknowledging it. I'm hoping there's more. I know one of the women on the school board, she runs Child Protect, and she had started focusing on how to get these children that maybe they didn't lose their friend, so they're not identified at school for needing counseling, but they were at the crime scene when someone else died. There's programs in other places that are like targeting those kids that they see, like, and making sure that they're connected with some counseling and some services. And so we're talking more about that and, having a solutions story follow up on that effort.
I have a feeling that your reporting is going to inspire a lot of other journalists, just the way Sonali Kohli's inspired you. What advice do you have for individuals who may be writing about the impact of violence in their own campus communities?
You have to make sure that you are trusted by people that live in this community. You've already built that trust. I started this with community leaders that I'd done stories with on the past and had already built that relationship with them. So when I went to them and said, this is my idea, they knew I wasn't coming from a judgmental or harmful lens. They knew it was about wanting to help. And so, they were open about their own struggles and how they felt. And then they connected me with younger people that I otherwise wouldn't have access to talk about these. So it has to start there. First trust, then go to the community leaders, and then just don't rush on something like this. I'd hoped to have this done before the summer started because the summer is so violent, and I wanted people to really be discussing this ahead of time, perhaps to have some sort of solutions in the works. And then the pandemic happened and it completely went to the back burner. But there's no way I could have done this in a faster fashion because I needed to process how I felt about it. And I went through all these different stages of overwhelmed to feeling desensitized to overwhelmed again. And so going on that journey on my own helped me to imagine how these children were feeling as well.
Now that this project is done, Krista, what's on your deck and on your plate for the next few months?
A million things that stopped because of the pandemic. I'm working on a story about the magnet school system here in Montgomery. Our magnet schools are some of the best in the country, and the traditional schools are not. And the demographics of the students who attend these schools are complete opposite. So I'm focusing on that and kind of what it means to the community, because many parents feel if they don't get into these magnet schools that they are forced either to pay private tuition or to leave the city, and the impact that then has on the traditional schools. So that's what I want to do next.
It sounds like a great project. I look forward to reading it. Thank you so much for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much.
Reporter Krista Johnson is an education reporter at the Montgomery Advertiser, and she's a member of EWA. That wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.